They mocked the black girl in Jiu-Jitsu 59 seconds later. She silenced the entire class. She walked into the dojo quiet, focused, respectful. A young black girl in a white GI that looked just a little too clean, just a little too new. The air in the room shifted when she entered, not loudly, not openly, but in the way that glances were exchanged, in the way smirks tugged at the corners of some mouths. She stepped onto the mat like it was sacred, bowing before she crossed its edge. Her eyes scanning the room with calm confidence, not arrogance, just presence. She wasn't here to prove anything, not yet, not to them, but they had already decided who she was, or rather, who they thought she wasn't. In the far corner, a group of students chuckled under their breath. One nudged the other and nodded. Toward her, the unspoken message clear, this will be easy. Another whispered just loud enough for it to sting, she won't last around. It wasn't new to her, not the whispers, not the sideways looks, not the way people underestimated her before she even moved. This wasn't her first time being the only one who looked like her in the room. It wasn't her first time being judged before she even had a chance to show what she could do. But every time it happened, it still hit the same. Like a silent dare, she made her way to the center and joined the others. She bowed to the instructor, nodded politely to the students, and began to stretch. Her movements were deliberate, clean, controlled, but the others didn't notice. They were too busy watching for her to mess up, waiting to laugh. Their eyes said it all, "Ooh, don't belong here." But she ignored them. Not because she didn't hear them, she heard everything. But because she had heard it all before, and she knew what they didn't. She knew what was coming. She knew what 59 seconds could change. One student, taller and older, looked at her like she was a joke, just another warm-up before the real sparring. He wouldn't be laughing for long. Neither would the rest of them. Because this wasn't just about Jiu-Jitsu. This was about something much deeper. This was about walking into a space that wasn't built for you and making it yours anyway. It was about moving in silence and letting your skills speak so loudly that no one could deny you. It was about knowing that you are more than what they see, more than what they expect, more than what they can handle. But they didn't know that yet. All they saw was a quiet black girl in a white GI. All they noticed was that she didn't talk much. All they assumed was that she was weak, that she was inexperienced, that she'd be on the mat in seconds, defeated, embarrassed, gone. But they didn't see the hours of training, the years of discipline, the nights she spent practicing in silence, in sweat, in solitude. They didn't see the strength behind the calm, the storm behind the silence. And that was their first mistake, because she wasn't here to entertain them. She wasn't here to be liked. She wasn't here to explain herself or defend her presence. She was here for one reason only, to do what she came to do. And in 59 seconds, the entire room would understand exactly who they were dealing with. They just didn't know it yet. They thought they were watching a beginner step into a ring she didn't belong in, but they were wrong. So wrong. And the clock was already ticking. As the class began to stretch, the tension in the room thickened like mist settling over a battlefield before dawn. It wasn't the kind of noise you could point to, not laughter echoing off the walls, but something more insidious, the kind of teasing that's meant to fly just under the surface, safe from consequence, loud enough to hurt. A chuckle here, a smirk there, a quick glance followed by a shake of the head as if her presence was just some strange joke the universe had played on them all. The room moved around her, students leaning into their stretches, cracking jokes between each pose, but she remained centered, controlled, grounded. She didn't shift her eyes to meet theirs. She didn't react, not because she didn't notice, but because she didn't need to. Reactions are for those who feel the need to defend. She had nothing to defend, she simply stretched. She reached for her toes with the same quiet intensity she had used to walk into the dojo. Every movement was purposeful, practiced. This was not new to her. These stretches were rituals, ones her muscles remembered even when her mind was overwhelmed. Her breathing was deep, steady, as if the outside world couldn't touch her. Around her, students side-eyed, her presence nudging one another with smug expressions, already preparing themselves for the lesson they assumed she'd receive. Some even started to whisper, mock encouragement, thinly veiled sarcasm, hiding under a fake tone of support. "Hope you're ready," one said behind her back. "Better not cry when he takes you down," said another. But she didn't even blink. She finished each stretch with quiet grace, her eyes closed in brief moments of focus, tuning everything out. She wasn't stretching just to warm up her body. She was ready in her mind. The mind that had been trained, not just in martial arts, but in resilience, the mind that knew how to hold its ground when the world demanded it fold. Her body was a temple, but her mind was the gatekeeper, and it allowed no fear through those doors. The instructor stood at the front, calling names, pairing students together. Each match made casually, carelessly, until her name was said. And then there was a pausage long enough for the air to shift again. His eyes scanned the room, and they landed not on a beginner, but on the most skilled student in the dojo, the tall, muscular boy in the back who had already made his opinion of her very clear. The instructor's voice was calm, but the subtext echoed through the walls. "You'll be with him. Not as a challenge, not even as a fair test, but as a decision rooted in expectation. As if pairing her with the top student would be enough to quietly put her back in her place. As if this one round would show her why she didn't belong. Some of the students didn't even bother to hide their reactions this time. One widened his eyes as if shocked at the cruelty. Another snorted, unable to stop himself from grinning. The boy she was paired with didn't say a word. He just looked her up and down and smirked. The kind of smirk that dripped with certainty, with condescension. He was already imagining how quickly it would be over. She stood. No words, no reaction. She bowed to the instructor with the same calm grace she'd used when she first entered. She walked to the center, facing the boy, and bowed again. There was no anger in her, no panic. She wasn't shaking. Her breath was slow, controlled. She had faced harder things than this. The match hadn't started yet, but she was already steady, balanced, as if every mocking word had dissolved before it could touch her, as if she were untouchable. The boy cracked his neck and bounced on his heels, eager to begin. Around them, the class settled into a tense silence, ready to witness what they assumed would be a quick humiliation. But what they didn't see, what they refused to see, was the stillness inside her. The storm that didn't rage, but waited, quiet, precise, unapologetic. She breathed in, long and deep. Not for show, not for drama, but because it was part of the process. The rhythm of her preparation. The discipline that no one had seen, but that lived in her bones. Every inch of her was trained. Not to impress, not to dazzle, but to withstand, to move only when the moment was right. To act only with intention. To fight with the quiet confidence of someone who had already survived more than just physical opponents. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak. She simply took her position. The same way she had taken her place in the world 1,000 times. Before, among doubt, against expectations, in silence. Around her, they still thought they knew how this would end. They still believed that strength was loud, that skill had a look, that experience wore a face they were familiar with. But they were wrong. Again, because she didn't need to respond to their doubts. She didn't need to push back against their assumptions. She had one job, one focus. One moment to answer everything they thought they knew, with movement, with mastery, with 59 seconds of truth that would rewrite the narrative entirely. She bowed once more, locked eyes with her opponent, and waited. The warm-up was over, and the real lesson was about to begin. The moment the signal was given, the room seemed to hold its breath. Her opponent didn't wait. He didn't calculate. He lunged forward the second the match began. Fast, aggressive, overconfident. The kind of rush that didn't come from strategy but from ego. His movements were loud, muscular, designed to intimidate. But intimidation only works when fear is present, and she had left fear behind long ago. The students watching from the sidelines leaned forward instinctively, their anticipation thick with expectation. They were ready for her to stumble, ready for the so-called lesson they believed she was about to learn. This was the moment they thought would define her, her fall, her failure, her embarrassment. But the truth was, this moment wasn't going to define her. It was going to reveal her. Her opponent came in high, arms wide, expecting her to recoil. But she didn't. In fact, she stepped in, not away, not backin, and in that fraction of a second, everything changed. With one fluid motion, she dipped under his arms, her body slipping past his brute force like water. He was strong, yes, but strength, without control, is just weight, and weight can be used against itself. She rotated sharply, her balance centered, eyes locked onto his movements with absolute clarity. In less than a breath, her hand latched onto his GI near the shoulder, her foot slid behind his leg, and with a twist of her hips, she pulled. The move was so fast, so precise, that the room didn't even react until it was over. 1 second, he was standing smirking, charging, towering. The next, his body was airborne, feet off the ground, momentum stolen and reversed. And then, boom, he hit the mat, hard. The sound echoed across the dojo floor like a dropped truth. Not a scream, not a cry, just a heavy, final thud of impact. A sound that silenced every thought, every whisper, every ounce of doubt that had filled the room. Moments before, the boy blinked up at the ceiling, stunned, not hurt, just shocked, as if the world had flipped in ways he couldn't process. He had walked into that match assuming victory was his by default. That skill looked a certain way, spoke a certain way, showed up in bodies that matched his own. But now, flat on his back, looking up at the fluorescent lights and the stillness of a girl who hadn't even broken a sweat, he had no choice but to understand what had just happened. He hadn't lost to luck. He hadn't slipped. He hadn't been surprised by some cheap trick. He had been outmatched. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She didn't even look around for applause. Her eyes remained calm, focused, as if this moment was as routine to her as tying her belt. She stepped back, bowed politely, and waited. The class didn't erupt. There were no cheers, no chaos. Just a silence so complete it seemed to hum. It wasn't just the fall that stunned him, it was the way she had done it, with elegance, with discipline. Without a word, no one expected this. Not because they didn't think it was possible, but because they never even considered it. They didn't imagine her capable because they had already decided who she was. Before she ever moved, they had written her story. But stories written in assumption collapse the moment reality speaks, and today, reality came in the form of a 59-second lesson they would never forget. She had trained for this, not just the throw, not just the reflexes, but for this exact moment of disbelief. For the heavy pause in a room that didn't expect to be corrected. Every move she made was a testament to countless hours on the mat. Hours when no one was watching, when no one believed, when it was just her, discipline, and repetition. There was no shortcut to that throw, no magic to her technically, the raw, unglamorous work of commitment. And in that moment, when she turned his power against him and dropped him with perfect control, she wasn't just executing a technique. She was reclaiming her space. Across the dojo, students stared in frozen silence, struggling to process what they had just seen. Some exchanged glances, unsure whether to be impressed or embarrassed by their earlier mockery. One student near the back slowly shook his head, a mixture of awe and regret crossing his face. The instructor, too, remained still, perhaps reevaluating the decision to pair her against his top pupil, maybe even questioning what other biases had quietly shaped his choices. Because this match wasn't just about a fall, it was about every assumption that had fallen with it. She helped him up, not because she had to, not because anyone expected it, but because that's what martial artists do. There was no malice in her, no revenge, just respect for the art, for the match, even for the opponent who underestimated her. She bowed again, that same quiet bow she had entered with. Nothing had changed about her, but everything had changed around her. And still, she said nothing, no boast, no speech, no declaration of victory. Because power doesn't always shout. Sometimes it moves so cleanly that it steals the breath right out of a room. She returned to her spot, sat on her knees, hands resting in her lap, composed, grounded, and all around her. The silence grew not heavier but deeper. A silence not of disbelief anymore, but of recognition. She had arrived as a stranger to their world. But in 59 seconds, she had become undeniable. It hadn't even been a full minute, just 59 seconds. Not enough time for a second breath. Not enough time for strategy adjustments. Not enough time to process the beginning before the end had already arrived. In those brief seconds, everything they thought they knew unraveled. The match was over, but the echo of it lingered like thunder after lightning. It wasn't just that she had won, it was how she had done it. No panic, no flash, no hesitation. Just clean, undeniable technique. The kind of precision that doesn't shout for attention, because it doesn't need to. The kind that speaks volumes without saying a word. And in a room that had mocked her before she ever stepped on the mat, her silence now roared louder than anything they'd heard before. She hadn't flinched when the match started. She hadn't smiled when he fell. She didn't soak in the moment as if it were some surprise, because to her, it wasn't. She knew. She had always known. This wasn't luck. This wasn't a fluke. This was the result of countless repetitions, of quiet discipline, of years spent learning how to control not just her body, but her breath, her energy, her mind. And when it was done, when the so-called strongest student lay on the mat trying to understand what just happened, she didn't celebrate. She didn't pump her fists or nod smugly toward the stunned crowd. She simply extended her hand, helped him up with the same respect she gave to everyone, and bowed again. The dojo remained frozen. You could almost hear the sound of realization settling into each corner of the room. Mouths that had whispered doubt were now shut tight. Eyes that had rolled were now wide, stunned into stillness. There was no laughter now, no nudges, no smug smiles, just the truth, undeniable and absolute. For 59 seconds, she hadn't just performed a technique, she had held up a mirror to every assumption they had made. And in that reflection, they saw how wrong they'd been. The instructor didn't say anything. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable. But even he couldn't deny what had just taken place. He had paired her with his best student not to test her skill, but to prove, subtly, that she wasn't ready, that she didn't belong. But in doing so, he had given her the exact opportunity she needed. And she had answered not with defiance, not with ego, but with clarity. She didn't just win a match, she reset the expectations of an entire room. There was no soundtrack, no applause, just that weighty silence that follows something real, something raw, something that cuts through noise and leaves only truth behind. And in that silence, something else began to take root, respect. Not the kind that's given out of politeness, the kind that's earned, the kind that forces people to reevaluate, to adjust, to remember. She sat quietly on the mat, hands resting, gently on her knees, her breathing back to normal. You'd never guess she had just turned the room upside down. Her expression hadn't changed. She wasn't gloating. She didn't need to. That was the difference between her and them. They had needed noise. She had only needed a moment. And that moment, those 59 seconds would echo far beyond the dojo walls. It wasn't about defeating a student, it was about defeating doubt. She had walked into a space built on hierarchy, on assumptions, on unspoken rules about who gets to shine and who's expected to fall. And without a single word, she had rewritten the script, not with brute strength, not with aggression, but with focus, with technique, with absolute, unshakable confidence in her own preparation. The students slowly shifted, their movements cautious now, like they were walking in a place newly unfamiliar. It wasn't just that they had misjudged her, it was that they had never even tried to understand her. They had measured her against a scale that had never included her in the first place. But now, they couldn't unsee what they'd seen. The disbelief had faded. What replaced it wasn't just respect, it was reflection. For the first time, they weren't seeing a black girl in jiu-jitsu, they were seeing a martial artist, a technician, a practitioner, one who had done what very few ever do, had let her skills speak fully for her. No noise, no drama, just truth. And that truth didn't need explanation. It didn't need defense, it just needed to be witnessed. And it had been. Even her opponent, still stunned, sat quietly, not bitter, not angry, but changed. Something had shifted inside him, too. He had entered the match expecting to teach her a lesson, but he had been taught one instead. Not just about fighting, but about perception. About the danger of underestimating those who don't fit the image in your mind. And maybe that lesson would stay with him longer than any throw, any tap out ever could. She rose only when instructed, bowed again, and moved with the same calm grace as when she entered. She didn't rush, she didn't scan the room for reactions. Her power didn't come from their approval. It came from her own mastery, her own control, her own journey. And in those 59 seconds, she didn't just win. She reminded everyone in that room real strength isn't loud. Real power doesn't ask to be seen. Real skill speaks for itself. The instructor walked toward her slowly, his expression unreadable, but the silence around him said everything. The same man who had hesitated to give her a fair chance now found himself speechless, not because he had nothing to say, but because everything he had assumed had been undone in under a minute. His eyes, once casual and dismissive when he paired her with his strongest student, now searched her face with a quiet respect he hadn't shown before. There was no apology spoken, no grand gesture of recognition, but in that moment, the shift in him was clear. Sometimes, the greatest acknowledgement is the absence of dismissal, and he no longer dismissed her. Around the mat, the students who had laughed, smirked, whispered behind cupped hands, now stared in silence, no longer amused, no longer superior. The air had changed, no longer filled with doubt or mockery. It now held something heavier, more honest, awe. They had come expecting a show-on where the outsider would fail and their assumptions would be reinforced. But what they witnessed was something far more profound. A quiet dismantling of everything they thought they understood about strength, about worth, about who deserves to belong. One voice finally broke the silence, a low whisper from the back, filled not with sarcasm this time, but curiosity. Who trained her? The question hung in the air, unanswered but echoing with a new kind of reverence. But the real answer wasn't a name or a place. It wasn't a single coach or school. The real answer stretched across years of unseen work. Years of early mornings and sore muscles. Years of watching others be chosen first, celebrated louder, respected faster. Years of being underestimated, not just in gyms and dojos, but in classrooms, on streets, in systems. She had been trained by discipline, hardened by struggle, sharpened by the weight of low expectations. Her skill was forged not just through repetition, but through resistance. She had learned not only how to fight, but how to stand in spaces where no one made room for her and claim her right to be there anyway. She hadn't walked into that dojo to prove anyone wrong. That was never her purpose. That kind of motivation burns too fast. She wasn't driven by the need for revenge or validation. She walked in because it was simply where she belonged, just like any other student, just like any other fighter. The mat was hers, too, not because she demanded it, but because she had earned it long before anyone else knew her name. Her presence wasn't a challenge to the system, it was a correction. A reminder that greatness doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks in quietly, bows politely, and lets its actions do the speaking. And that's what they all realized now. The students, once amused, now sat still, replaying the moment in their minds, trying to catch what they missed. They saw her now, not as a surprise, but as someone who had always been capable. The only thing that had changed was their perspective. It wasn't her performance that was extraordinary, it was their expectations that had been so limited. And now, faced with the undeniable truth of her ability, they were forced to question not just what they believed about her, but what else they might have gotten wrong. The boy she had thrown stood quietly beside the group, his ego bruised not from defeat, but from recognition. Recognition that he had underestimated not just a competitor, but the art itself. Because jiu-jitsu was never about size, or strength, or swagger. It was about timing, technique, control. And she had embodied all of it in one clean, elegant motion. He didn't look at her with resentment. He looked at her the way every student should look at a masterful performance, with humility. With respect. She didn't look for their stares. She didn't seek validation in their silence. She simply returned to her place, her body still calm, her posture still perfect. For her, nothing had changed. But for the room around her, everything had. Where once there had been laughter, there was now reflection. Where once there was judgment, there was now curiosity. The dojo didn't just witness a victory, it witnessed a transformation. Not of her, but of themselves. And the shift didn't come from confrontation. It came from clarity. She didn't argue for her place, she demonstrated it. She didn't demand acknowledgement, she left no room for denial. That's the power of presence when it's rooted in truth. It doesn't ask, it simply is. And once it's seen, it cannot be unseen. As the instructor gave an odd small, but sincere, it was more than approval. It was a sign that the room had changed. That maybe next time, when someone walks through that door, quiet and unexpected, they'll think twice before laughing. Maybe they'll pause before whispering doubts. Because now they know. Now they've seen what happens when discipline meets opportunity. What happens when you stop underestimating and start paying attention. She had not only earned her spot, she had expanded the definition of what belonging looks like. And in doing so, she reminded every person in that room, no one owns the mat. You earn it every day. With sweat, with patience, with grit, and sometimes, with 59 seconds of undeniable truth.